forward our zest for literature, it is now a time for our next book of the day, which is The Fate of Butterflies. This breathtaking new novel confronts the toxic dangers of the historical movement: war, religious polarization, authoritarian charisma, and a dystopian future that is already upon us. The critic for this book is Ms. Rumina Sethi, who has been recently nominated to the General Council of the Sahitya Academy, New Delhi. She holds a PhD from the Trinity College, Cambridge, and was a British Academy Fellow at Oxford, a position she held for 4 years. She has lectured widely and is published in many international journals. Her books include Myths of the Nation and The Politics of Post-Colonialisms. At present, she is a professor at the Punjab University. The author of the book is Ms. Nayanthara Sehgal. She is the author of 9 novels, 6 non-fiction works, a collection of short stories, and a wide-ranging literary and political commentary. She has received the Sahitya Academy Award, the Sinclair Fiction Prize, and the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. We now invite Ms. Nayanthara Sehgal and Ms. Rumina Sethi for their discussion on the book.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our guest doesn't really need any introduction, but I have to mention something very brief, a little event that took place when I met her for the first time in 1989 at the University of Kent in Canterbury, where Nayanthara Sehgal made quite a revolutionary splash when she made this particular statement at her lecture. And she said that there are very powerful winds blowing through literature. Very powerful winds blowing through literature, which was a very candid statement to make at that time, because she was obviously speaking about the empire writing back to the center. In the 1980s and later in the 1990s, there was a lot of literature that was written by the erstwhile empire of Britain. I think perhaps we could say even today that there are very powerful winds that are blowing through Indian literature. Of course, there is a different center now. All of Nayanthara ji's work, her fiction, is related to the political climate of the times. She was a very outspoken critic of the emergency. Every novel that she has written is connected with, the growth of modern India after Indian independence. So if I might say, each of your novels, Nayanthara ji, is related to the production of modern India, the making of modern India, as it were. But I read The Fate of Butterflies, and in many ways I thought that perhaps this was a book which did the opposite. You are speaking here about the unmaking of modern India.
That's right, Rumina, and please drop the G.
Okay, I'd love to.
We're all equals in the world of literature. Thank you. Can I just tell you briefly what this novel is about, The Fate of Butterflies? But before I do that, let me salute a very great Indian, Guru Nanak, whose message of world brotherhood and his respect for all religions we should be celebrating today, and we should be remembering it. So I salute Guru Nanak. Well, this is a novella. You can see it's a very thin book, which would take a couple of hours to read. And what do I mean by a novella? See, some people think of it as a short novel. Some people think of it as a long short story. But I have thought of this and my previous novella as more related to poetry. Because in a poem, as you all know, one line of poetry or one verse of poetry can convey a whole wealth of meaning, which a prose novel would take pages to convey. So this is why it is small, and this is why I think it is packed, it's weighted with meaning, as if you ever read it, you will discover. So the fate of butterflies is about several things, but mainly it's about love. The love of a man for a woman, the love of a man for a man, and the love of some Indians for freedom. It's also about gang rape. Now, I'm assuming that none of us women in this room has ever been raped, but it is something we are reading about all the time. The rape of women and even children, and gang rape of many of them. And the thought of this has haunted me, because I've wondered, what kind of life can a woman expect to have after such a horrible experience? There can be no worse experience for any woman than this. So because it haunted me so much, this is one of the things that the story is also about. And then it's also about a European who has made a fortune out of manufacturing armaments and supplying them for wars. Never mind which war, you know, any war. He's made his fortune out of war. So briefly, that's what the novel is about.
In fact, as you said quite rightly, it's a small book. And at first, I read it very quickly. And then, since I was going to be in conversation with you, I read it the second time, slowly. And last night, I thought I would go over it yet again, at least certain parts of it, so that I do justice to being here. And I thought that every word was giving me much more than it gave me the first time, that in spite of its small size, and you call it novella, it's so layered, so nuanced, and I thought that there were some very major themes, very big themes. Of course, you speak about the gun lobby, you are speaking about war crimes and the rapes of women activists, of human rights activists. This book is also about the criminalization of homosexuality, the love between a man and a man.
Yeah.
And most importantly, I think, this novel is about fundamentalism bordering on fascism. This novel began quite violently, and I was trying last night to think about what were these very violent episodes that I read about. There is one event which left its mark upon my mind, about a man wearing nothing except a skull cap, and he is cut in the middle, and everybody can see.
He's lying dead in the street.
Absolutely, lying dead in the street when our protagonist passes by in his car and is absolutely, struck dumb by the episode. You can see on the wall behind you a very gruesome picture of an axe which is bloody. This is one very violent event. The other one you speak about, the rape, of course. The third one is that of the chef, Rafiq, who cooks Mughlai food and then suddenly disappears from this
because
dhaba
he's
or
Muslim.
cafe because he is Muslim. And he's probably been bundled into some camp and nobody knows whether he's dead or alive.
Yeah. Don't reveal.
They don't reveal.
You don't reveal.
Yes, I won't. I certainly won't. No spoilers here. And so I was struck by rather a lot of violence. I know that you always write political novels, and that politics is very closely connected with you personally.
Well, you see, a writer takes the material that she has. We all take the material that is around us. And for me, there was nothing but political material, because I grew up in a political family. My family was fully involved in the struggle for freedom under the nonviolent leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. My childhood was spent largely separated from my parents. My uncle, of course, spent 10 years in jail, Jawaharlal Nehru. My mother had 3 terms of imprisonment. My father had 4 terms of imprisonment, and he died of his 4th term of imprisonment. Together, my parents spent about 8 years in jail, which is a long time in the life of a child. So I have been very concerned through my writing about individual freedom, about national freedom, the whole question of freedom.
In fact, there is a kind of a criticism of what is happening nowadays. And I remember one particular situation in the novel where there is a kind of sweeping generalization. And that sweeping generalization is, it's never been so good. We've never had it so good. Everybody seems to be working for the public good. So I thought to myself, what is the public good? And the answer that I could come up with is the greatest good of the greatest number. But somehow the tone of the novel was more menacing, sinister, I would say, and forced me to look beyond that, because it is not so easy to say that it is the greatest good of the greatest number that is happening in the current situation, wherever we come from, whether we come from Europe or whether we come from America or we are here in India. But there was also a parallel statement that came to my mind, that we know what's best for you. And that seemed to be the prevailing mood of the novel as well. Whenever there are get-togethers where our protagonist visits, what is this great good that, you know, the mastermind, one character in your novel, seems to be speaking about?
Well, I mean, the mastermind in the novel is a man who is high up in the political setup, and it is he who decides policies. And he, of course, follows the policies which we see happening around us today, which are an exact copy of the kind of policies adopted by Nazi Germany after the Second World, before the Second World War, of dividing its people into Jews and non-Jews. And of course, it was the gas chamber for the Jews. And here we are seeing, well, somewhat of a comparison with this National Citizens Register, which we have been told will wipe out Islam from India. That's our equivalent of the gas chamber. So these are the kind of policies which the mastermind is following, and which the protagonist, whose name is Prabhakar, he is a Maharashtrian, he is a writer also. He teaches literature and history. No, sorry, he teaches political science at a university. And he's also a writer of a sardonic kind. He likes to make fun of situations. And one of the books he's just written is about what would happen in a country if it abandoned all the values which it had been following up to now. Reverence for Rabindranath Tagore, reverence for Mahatma Gandhi, reverence for the Buddha, reverence for nonviolence, supposing that a country had decided this is all wrong, we don't want this anymore. Supposing the opposite became true, violence, mutual hatred, and so on. And he's written this book in a kind of to amuse himself. It's an act of his imagination, but it's taken up by the mastermind as truly what Prabhakar stands for, which is not so.
In fact, just to let the audience know, and I think Nayantara has already spoken to you about what the novel says to us, it's about an intellectual, maybe we can call him that, who's teaching at a university, who is writing a novel. So what is the interesting thing for me is that there is a novel being written in the novel. This novel is misunderstood largely by the political dispensation. And Prabhakar is invited to a closed group meeting where there are largely foreigners. And I thought Europeans, largely French and German people. And I thought I would just read a passage if I could, just to give everybody a sense of it, just a few lines. Would you like to?
I've got another passage.
Oh, you want to read? But this is just a little bit because my question will be framed on that. This is at the beginning of the novel. Prabhakar was acquainted with the changing mood in Europe and had acquainted his students with the return of the crooked swastika. I'm mentioning this because you spoke of fascism. The stiff arm salutes, the goose stepping and its other street corner manifestations, but he had never met the mood. Now, mood is with a capital M. Here it was, uniting Europeans as they had never been united. This is how it is, and what is being done about it, he heard them say. There is a passion now evident all over Europe for an end to intrusions, nay, invasions by outsiders. We must seal our borders to keep outsiders out. Keep Europe secure, keep Europe pure, keep Europe Christian, keep Europe European. This was the refrain all around the room. Prabhakar sat back in his chair, baffled and bemused. Europe had conquered the world. Europe had intruded, invaded, occupied, ruled and plundered the world. Could power and fury, power and glory feel so besieged? Now, this struck me as one of the very significant passages, and I thought that I would ask you that you personified this mood as if it were a person. What is this mood? Obviously, it is linked to the idea of fascism that you see in every situation around the country. And you being an extremely outspoken critic of the way in which democracy has been curtailed now, before, all the time, would you tell us a little bit about what you mean by this mood?
The mood which is now prevailing?
Yes, and the one that figures in the novel, obviously.
Yes. Well, what can I say about the prevailing mood? If we read history, we know that it began with Mr. Nene, a member of the RSS, or the Hindu Mahasabha, I forget which, in 1933 or something. He goes to Italy and gets a personal interview with Mussolini, and he seeks Mussolini's advice. He says he admires Mussolini's fascism greatly, and he seeks his advice about how we should proceed in India, and Mussolini gives him his advice that you must become violent. You must train children from the age of 6 to get used to the idea of war and that kind of thing. This is history. I haven't made this up. So Mr. Nene got this advice, and of course, we know that ये लोग जो आजकल शासन कर रहे हैं, ये हित्या के भक्त हैं. That's how it began.
In fact, it's quite interesting that you mentioned Mussolini, because I remember while you were speaking about him and about the RSS connection, that there was this writer called Leon Ginsberg, who is a Holocaust survivor. And he had translated Tolstoy a great deal. And he speaks about how during the times of Mussolini, all the professors, all the intellectuals were expected to sign a declaration of loyalty to the regime at that time. And because of the pressures, 11,000 professors signed the declaration of loyalty to Mussolini, and only 10 professors did not sign. And Leon Ginzburg was one among them. And needless to say, Ginzburg was, of course, deported from Italy, but after Mussolini died, he came back to Italy, but nonetheless, fascism in Italy was so strong at that time that he was imprisoned. And from prison, he sent out a short letter to his wife, Natalia, and the last words of that letter are, "Be brave." Sometimes when I listen to you, or when I read your books, when I listen to your speeches, I wonder what gives you that courage. Is it because you come from a family that was radicalized and you spent your childhood amongst people who were politically so active? How do you have the courage to speak so openly and candidly to power or the forces of power?
I don't think of it as courage. I just think of it as the right thing to do. We should, all be doing it. And many of us are doing it. Authors, historians, students. Kanhaiya Lal started a whole movement for students, and I don't know what his fate is going to be. It still has not been announced. But I think the best way to be a political activist for a writer is through her writing. Artists are political activists by the way they write, by the way they paint, by the songs they sing, by the plays which they write, which are performed for all the world to see. These are our ways of political activism. We don't go out and make speeches about it. This is an act of political activism. I think we have to deal with our activism creatively. Create something for people to, read and remember. We die, but our work doesn't die. So that is why all dictators are afraid of art and literature, because literature lives on. I think this is the best way to deal with it and not to talk about what is happening today. I can read.
Yes, but yes, very much. Would you like to read that passage now? Which
No,
spoke of?
I'll read a passage which has nothing to do with politics. As I said, we reflect our views differently through writing, through art. We don't keep on talking about political matters. It's done differently. And in this case, because I have been so haunted by this fact of so many women being raped and gang raped, this is about that. This professor of political science, Prabhakar, he has read about this woman's evidence about the gang rape at her trial. He has also met her only once at the house of a friend, and he has fallen in love with her by meeting her, but also because of what he knows about her through the evidence that she gave. So he finds out where she lives, and he goes to her house. He's never been there before, and he's only met her once. The house was in a quiet corner of a shady lane. And if there had once been a name on the gate, it was no longer there. The high wall on either side of the gate was embedded with jagged, broken glass, and the short path to the house was hedge-lined and unevenly pebbled. It would be rough on shoe soles and very hard on tires. To discourage visitors, Prabhakar bumped his car up the drive. The front veranda was curtained off by low-hanging bougainvillea. It was a house in Parda. He was admitted to a room whose furniture was minimal and geometrical. It was all straight lines and sharp corners. It was not intended for lounging. Flamboyance lined one wall in a painting of warlike shapes in a blaze of discordant colors by a famous painter of a massacre during the exodus of partition. The polished floor had scattered rugs on it that he could not help describing to himself as woven of bleeding red and bitter orange. It was a stark room that said, "State your business and go." He had not even planned what to say, and he had no idea how he would explain his presence. He remained standing. Then a door behind him opened and closed, and he turned around to see that she had come in. She was all in white cotton sari and a white sleeveless choli that forced his attention to a raw-looking, ugly patchwork of ridged scars along her naked upper arm. The sight was so repellent that it made him go swiftly to her, and hardly realizing it, he put his arms around her. His shock was immense when she gave a strangled scream of a cry and broke violently away from him. Striving for composure, she sat down, motioned him to a chair, and covered her face with her hands. When she raised her head, she said, quite matter-of-factly, "It was the contact. I can't manage physical contact of any kind anymore." The enormity of what she had said and left unsaid kept him from saying anything at all. It was the difference, the great void between reading about it and seeing it for oneself. He grappled with her problem. There were times that called for the crutch of religion, but he didn't know if that crutch was available to her. He had none to offer. He had no religion other than reason. But the scripture of his childhood had been Christian, and it had been awash with miracles. The miracle of the loaves and fishes, the miracle of water miraculously made into wine, and most miraculous of all, the command to a corpse to get up and walk, which the corpse obeyed. Lazarus in the Bible stood up and walked as if he had never been dead. Nothing less than a miracle of that drastic kind would restore her fully to the world of the living. She said, "Will you have a cup of coffee?" And that eased the high tension between them. She said she remembered meeting him at Francois's house. She had not been able to let him know that she couldn't come last Wednesday to his place because he had not given her his phone number. The coffee was hot, strong, and reviving. It was a painkiller of a kind. And the atmosphere scaled down to nearly normal. She had spoken so frankly and unsparingly about herself, and this allowed him to be as plain-spoken. telling her that he knew about her ordeal because he had read the evidence she had given at the trial? Would she look upon him as a friend? Could they meet and talk? Could he take her out occasionally? Because getting out and about might help. A puzzled look greeted his proposal, but this was what she was doing, getting out and about. That is how they had happened to meet. In fact, meeting people and being sociable had been prescribed as therapy, and the psychiatrist had called it a necessary part of her treatment after her abortion and her stay in hospital for other damages. She'd been doing as prescribed, as well as getting on with writing her report. But yes, it would be nice to meet. She and her colleagues were writing their accounts of the areas they had been assigned, as well as their own earlier personal experiences. And these were going to be published as a book by a feminist press abroad, as the new law about womanly modesty would ban its publication here. Prabhakar asked, hardly daring to, but horribly aware of her butchered arm. He asked if her injuries had healed as far as possible. Well, she said the outer ones had healed, yes, but as far as he could see, they had left their permanent reminder. But it was policy decided by herself and two of her colleagues who had been raped in other such wars to leave their outer wounds exposed. Rape had been hidden, and talk about it had been forbidden for too long. And besides, she said that she, who for some reason fate had let live, had a duty to her tortured and slaughtered companions and their little children. And she must let her wounds speak for them. She offered him more coffee. Frank and forthcoming though she had been, a matter of policy as she called it, she had kept off any mention of her invisible wounds and the interior havoc that rape had made, making a human touch unendurable. He knew that trespass into that zone would not be permitted. He understood, as if she had said it, that the frigid wasteland that she now inhabited was one that she must find her way out of alone. But yes, she acknowledged that life did have to go on. Thank you.
In fact, there's another long passage to do with the actual atrocities that were committed on these women when Katrina, who you spoke of just now, recounts her experiences when she went into a village with the other women and how they were all raped and beaten up.
We shouldn't tell the whole story.
All right. No, they have to read it themselves. But I thought in so many ways, because in the beginning I spoke about several incidents of violence, of which you have read one of them. Do you think we are looking to see a kind of a dystopian world? Because is this story situated in the present moment, or is it situated a decade away from today? Are we looking to see something
it's the
so
times
utterly
that
painful?
we are living in. After all, what does a writer write about but the times that we are living in? And even if he's writing about a historical situation, it's from the from the point of view, from the perspective of the times that he is living in. So it is not a dystopian matter that we are going to see. It's what
right
we are
now.
seeing.
It's existing right now. And that reminds me of a speech of yours that I once heard, at the end of which you said that you were in the room in Birla House when the Mahatma was shot. And you were a little girl at that time. And you made a promise to yourself as a little girl.
I made a promise to myself. I was and looking at Gandhiji's body laid out, and I made a promise to myself that I would never let him die. And so all my books, my fiction and my non-fiction, has reflected his non-violence, the way that we should act toward each other, and not all of his beliefs. Some of his beliefs were very peculiar, let me tell you. I heard a story from my mother that when she and my father were married, Gandhiji was a visitor to the wedding. He stayed in Anand Bhavan with the family. And after the marriage, my mother and father went to him for his blessing. And Gandhiji gave them a long lecture on celibacy. What a thing to say to a young couple who have just got married. And my mother, who had been brought up to speak her mind, she said, "No, Bapu, we will not be celibate because I love Ranjit and we love each other." So he smiled. He said, "So you love each other?" And
No, but Gandhiji also often broke with the model.
yes.
Or the formula that he urged everyone to maintain. He often also broke his rules.
Well, he was very peculiar in many of his views, but his greatness is undeniable. He brought us to freedom. And Nehru, who was his heir, then, and Nehru's great colleagues, let us never forget Ambedkar, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, Maulana Azad, all these, that great generation which then carried out, built the foundation that our republic was then built on, of secularism, democracy, and respect for all religions, because India housed many religions and India wished to honor them all. So this was the foundation laid, and that was the greatness of Gandhi, that he brought us to the moment where this could happen.
And yet, in this novel, you make statements about how in the present situation there is a clean sweep of the founding fathers. And of course, by founding fathers, you definitely mean Mahatma Gandhi, but you also mean Ashoka, and you also speak of the Buddha, and you speak of the end of compassion, renunciation, repentance, which are virtues that these three great men stand for. So the new world that we are speaking about, which seems to be pervading the pages of your novel, is all about the end of this kind of compassion, greatness, which used to be the hallmarks of our democracy once upon a time.
Yes, and it was countries in the West considered India a miraculous democracy. This was their expression, because it was a democracy in impossible conditions. We had been impoverished by 200 years of plunder by Britain, first by the East India Company, then by the Crown. We were, because of that, probably the poorest country in the world. We had we had to start from scratch. And this was a huge effort which India made. And in spite of all these, this background of impoverishment and so on, we were determined to be democratic. And so our founding fathers declared democracy before development. They gave all Indians the right to vote. Rich, poor, whether they held property or not, whether they were educated or not, every Indian voted. And also, they gave women the vote. It was the first country in history to give women the vote, not as a gift, but as their human right. In no other country did women vote. Yeah. In every country, women had to fight for the vote. Some to this day do not have the vote. So it was a great, great achievement, and why India was considered a miracle of a democracy. And you know, it's my belief that when Indira Gandhi declared an emergency, and then when she declared an election, I think believing that she would win, it was the people of India who brought her down, not the upper crust, not the rich and highly educated, the people of India, because they had got used to exercising their vote. That was the weapon that they had in their hands, and they used it. And so I must say, I had great admiration, and I still do, for the Aam Aadmi, for the people of India.
But there seems to be a kind of a burial of that memory. There appears to be a burial of that kind of democracy. And one wonders, you know, there are several other writers, because we were speaking of literature a moment ago, who have spoken of, you know, the death of Gandhi as a philosophy, Gandhianism as a philosophy. And I'm reminded of Namdeo Dhasal, who speaks very openly, although I have my issues with him on so many fronts, but he says about this extreme right-wing ideology that brought these founding fathers down. He says, yesterday they murdered Gandhi, and now they are thinking of killing the whole nation, you know, by playing the politics of chastisement. There are people like Safdar Hashmi, for example, who was in fact performing a play called Halla Bol at a time that he was killed. And every year, these groups of playwrights calling themselves Sehmat, on the day of his death anniversary, remember him and commemorate his memory, because people like that stood for ideals which are gradually slipping away. So,
no, I would disagree with one point that you make, because, I mean, this is one experience I can give you, is that, you know, I was invited. I'm half Marathi, of which I'm very proud, as much as I am of my mother's Kashmiri birth and background. And my father was a Sanskrit scholar who translated the Raj Tarangini into English. That was, I think, a year ago translated into Marathi. And two of my novellas, this and the previous one, have been accepted by a Marathi publisher. So I was invited to the Marathi Sahitya Sammelan, which takes place in Pune. It's a very prestigious event where writers from all over India attend. And I was invited to inaugurate that. And I was really very happy about it. I felt it was almost a tribute to my father's scholarship and his memory. And then the government of Maharashtra revoked the invitation. I was disinvited. So my speech was never read out. I had sent it. It had been translated into Marathi, but it couldn't be read out at the function. But that turned out to be a very good thing, because the Marathi translation was distributed all over the towns of Maharashtra and read by thousands of people, which would never have happened if I had only read it to an audience of writers gathered together. So that is, and then the Marathi writers showed their huge support for me. They had a meeting in Mumbai. I was invited to address them. I can't tell you how moved I was. Now, here's a situation where the government was banning or crushing freedom of speech and all the rest of it, and banning writers and shooting some. 4 writers were shot dead. And on the other hand, the people were rising up to defend freedom of speech. That's an example.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So.
But literature has always done that. Literature has always tried to, destroy the fundamentalism of history or the demagoguery of history. Literature and people who write literature are always standing for, right from the time of Auden, for example, and I'm reminded of his poem in the memory of W.B. Yeats, when he speaks in favor of the poet. Follow poet, follow right, to the bottom of the night, and with your unconstraining voice, still persuade us to rejoice. And I thought that in your novel, in spite of several incidents of violence and pain, I thought that there was, you had set store a lot on the side of peace and compassion. And somewhere in your novel, you speak of how a writer is not even terrified of his head blown off, and the writer will still celebrate laughter. He or she will still celebrate compassion and peace. So somewhere on another plane, your novel is definitely speaking to us about civilization. And I thought that was such a tremendous word in the manner in which you speak of civilization, that we all want to, masculinize, we all want to stabilize, is nothing except civilized behavior. What makes civilization is civilized behavior. So I think it all tied up very well with the evocation of the Founding Fathers and bringing back peace and laughter and compassion back into our discourse.
I had a very close friendship with Kiran Nagarkar, who died recently. And I had dedicated my previous novella to him, and in fact, he provided a quote for this one. But I said to Kiran, because he was suffering ill health and he was very down, I said, I want to dedicate this one to you also. So he was very pleased about that. But then he said, I don't know if I can hog another dedication. So I found a song from an old Hollywood movie, which seemed to reflect the spirit of the book. It was called Let's Face the Music and Dance. The lines of it I sent to Kiran. There may be trouble ahead, but while there's moonlight and music and love and romance, let's face the music and dance. So he wrote back to me saying, I love the song, and yes, please use that as a dedication, so I did. And it reflects the spirit of the book where everything is terrible, things are sad and terrible things are happening. But as one young homosexual says to his guests at a party, what can we do in such grim times except celebrate
and dance.
By, facing the music and dancing. Yeah. So it reflects the spirit of the book.
Absolutely, absolutely. So everything is not so bleak. Maybe we could have a few questions from the audience.
Hello, ma'am. I'm Rajesh. I teach English at Punjab University. I'm a student of Professor Sethi. I have a question. It's my worry also. So we are talking so much about democracy. And democracy is something which is sandwiched between two violent forces. One that is communalism, fascism, and the other one is neoliberalism. And when you say neoliberalism, in it there is nothing called liberal left. It is all kind of like a demolishing, dismantling. It is all anti-democratic thing. Okay. So when you say neoliberalism, it's a kind of expansion of capitalism. And this is something like what you say, it is having its reach to our psyche also. Okay. So what I'm saying, like in the contemporary times, our psyche is very much hegemonized by the market forces. It has been co-opted. Okay. And what to say, utility has taken over the ethics. Okay. So when this is situation, then my question is this one, like what role can humanities and literature play so that people can start thinking about and fighting against this demon called, what to say, neoliberalism and what to say, this capitalism. So my question is to both of you, to Ma'am Sethi and the author.
Neoliberalism
and what to say, fascism.
Fascism.
I think democracy is sandwiched between these two forces.
He's saying that democracy is sandwiched between two forces, the forces of neoliberalism, about which there is nothing liberal, and fascism. So what is humanities, let's say liberal arts, supposed to do when you are sandwiched between these two forces?
Yes, I wish I could, I wish I had an answer to that, because many of us are in the situation of being squeezed between these two forces. And I don't think there's any easy way out. But I do wish that in the universities, at least the humanities could be not be deprived of funds, as is happening. You know, I have a fear that the present young generation, university level, may be, you know, excelling in commerce and technology and subjects of this kind, but they perhaps have not been given the opportunity to read great literature, great poetry, all the arts that really make up our culture. I don't know what can be done about it, except that these things should be restored in education. That's one way. And of course, that parents perhaps should try to provide examples to their children, because the youngest generation, the first-time voters, for instance, who I believe were very crucial in bringing the present situation to power, don't know our history. They really don't know what happened since 1947, because all that is being wiped out before their eyes. So it is up to parents, grandparents, you know, to try to restore their perspective of history and what India, what this republic tried to establish, you know, as a framework for all our people to grow. Of course, there have been failures. Of course, there have been shortfalls. But there was a great aspiration. And you know, if you are standing in a queue, you don't mind if it's a long queue, so long as it's moving up. And we were moving up, slowly but surely. All that is being wiped out, and I think education is the key to restoring it.
Quite correct, quite correct. And Rajesh, in Hitler's Germany, it was the liberal arts that were completely squeezed out of university education. So that, you know, I'm wondering that even within this group of intellectuals that we are speaking about, there are now two kinds of intellectuals. Earlier, of course, we spoke about the intellectuals and those who were not, those who were educated and those who were not. But now we speak of two kinds of intellectuals, and I'm thinking of Edward Said and Antonio Gramsci when I'm speaking about intellectuals. One, who in fact prop up the regime, who in fact support right-wing extremism, and the other, of course, who will, you know, ask about what is the truth, or ask difficult questions to the establishment and the power structures. And those who are the latter are now called so-called intellectuals. You know, I've often thought about who are these so-called intellectuals, and I'm thinking about Girish Karnad, for example. Just before he died, he attended a meeting in memory of Gauri Lankesh, and he wore a placard which said, "I am an urban Naxalite." So it seems that we have even forgotten what intellect and intellectual is all about. It's very hard to give an answer to your question that the forces of neoliberalism which say, and I said quite at the beginning of this talk, this conversation, that which say that, you know, we've never had it so good. And that is a mark of, you know, liberal democracies, and America is an example of that. And it supports itself with these kinds of statements, make America great again, you know? And if you look at or you read about the 1930s fascism, and there's a very interesting book that is written by Rob Raymond, which is called To Fight Against Fascism, in which he says that apart from xenophobia, what characterizes fascism is, you know, the removal of liberal arts from the curriculum, squeeze out their funding, as you say, and speak of being the greatest, as though there is no worry, there is nothing that you will aspire for, there is nobody to critique you, because it's never been so good. So that is your liberal democracy for you, which is bordering on fascism, in other words.
Good afternoon, ma'am. So you just narrated the incidents that when ma'am was a small child, and she was very much present in the Birla House when Mahatma Gandhi was shot dead. So we are 70 years young country now, and all that we remember Mahatma Gandhi is in our currency notes now. Recently I was out of India, and I met a Sudanese gentleman, and I asked him, what is going on in your country? And he explained to me the whole situation that's in his country. And then he quoted Mahatma Gandhi to me. I was so surprised. I'm like, we no longer quote him anywhere we go around the world, but people, when they find out that I'm an Indian, they quote Mahatma Gandhi to me. I was in Hawaii in January, and when people found out that I'm an Indian, they told me that the park adjacent to the place I was staying had a statue of Mahatma Gandhi. So somewhere the world has not forgotten Mahatma Gandhi, but we as Indians are forgetting Mahatma Gandhi, and all that we are talking about is just small facts of, say, celibacy, like you just quoted. He said he suggested celibacy to your parents, or the fact that, you know, his children were did not grow up in the right sense that we would call ideal parentage. But I would say he considered the whole Indian subcontinent as his children, and that is why today we are able to practice freedom, which we hardly even cherish. I was in Tanzania, and I shared a table with a white gentleman from South Africa, and one of them treated me like, oh my God, she belongs to a country my forefathers actually ruled. The next day I thought, oh my God, thank goodness, our forefathers have actually fought for freedom that we today hardly even cherish, sitting in a developing country, which is much better than so many countries around the world that I have at least seen. Thank you. So I wanted to ask, in what ways can we again relive Mahatma Gandhi? How can we make the present generation realize what the hard work and what his principles were, rather than just focusing on what he did not do right? But he has done so many things right. That is why we are 70 years old young country today. Not just us, but even Bangladesh and Pakistan, Pakistan as well. So what is it that the youth today should do to live up to his expectations and live up to his ideology? Non-violence is today very much required in our country. Yesterday I saw on the TV that the Uttar Pradesh government is getting prepared, calling people to actually throw stones on them to prepare themselves for the Ayodhya verdict today. So is there any format, or schools should again bringing the Gandhi subject in the schools? What should be done to make us realize, with the world has already recognized, but we are forgetting the great Mahatma Gandhi, father of our nation?
Would you like to say something?
You may, I don't know what to say. I mean, I know that this is happening. Again, what can we do when it is the present ruler's policy to wipe him out? You know, it is so difficult. The only way you can educate your people is through what students read in their books, in the books that are authorized for their studies. And those books are being rewritten. I am all for Indian culture being looked at deeply and properly. We have a great civilization. Hindu culture is a great universal culture. Of course, we should know more about it. Of course, in the colonized era, we were deprived of knowledge of ourselves. That has to be rectified, but not by saying that in Vedic times there was plastic surgery. You know, we need proper scholars to decide how our own culture should be revived and made real to Indians, but in the proper way, and not the way that it's being done.
I think as far as education is concerned, to answer your question, I think there has to be a greater sensitivity to history amongst the students. Because often when one speaks to one's students and says something about 1975, for example, all my students say, I wasn't born then. I seem to hear a lot of this, I wasn't born then, but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't know about World War I or about World War II or Hitler's Germany because I wasn't born then. Because we need to be sensitive to history.
Yeah.
And we need to celebrate, I think, syncretism, even chaos, and to depart from that whole idea of purity and homogenization as we celebrate literature and the various kinds of novels, poetry, which will help us to survive today. So I think we have approached the end of our time. And thank you so very much, Nayantara, for being with us today.
Thank you.
So nice to be with you. Thanks.
That was indeed a very insightful session. I would now like to invite Ms. Annie Sethi to present the token of appreciation to Ms. Nayantara Sehgal and Ms. Rurmila Sethi.